This was the longest war in the history of the United States. Welcome to WatchMojo.com, and today we'll be learning more about the Vietnam War. As part of the Cold War, the Vietnam War was a struggle against communism and an effort to limit its expansion.
If this little nation goes down the drain and can't maintain her independence, ask yourself what's going to happen to all the other little nations.
In 1954, Vietnam was split into two zones at the Geneva Conference. In North Vietnam was the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, which was a communist state led by Ho Chi Minh. South Vietnam was non-communist, and its first president was Ngo Dinh Diem. By mid-1955, Diem initiated a campaign denouncing communism. Suspected communist activities were punished with jail time and even death. His regime lost popularity to the point where a significant portion of South Vietnam supported the communists. This prompted a guerrilla campaign to pop up in the South in late 1956. Named the National Liberation Front, this movement was more commonly called the Viet Cong. As directed by Ho Chi Minh, they used armed propaganda to fight their battles. This targeted violence was initially aimed at politicians, but grew more widespread in the hopes of unifying the country under one communist regime. In an effort to limit the expansion of communism into neighboring countries, the United States began training forces in the South towards the end of the 1950s.
It's their war. They're the ones who have to win it or lose it. We can help them. We can give them equipment. We can send our men out there as advisors, but they have to win it, the people of Vietnam, against the communists.
At this time, with support from the U.S. government, a coup was being discussed to overthrow Diem. However, Diem was executed during the coup on November 2, 1963, without approval from the Americans. His death caused the political climate in the South to destabilize, and each new government toppled quickly. In August 1964, two alleged attacks on American warships were reported off North Vietnam's coast in the Gulf of Tonkin. This gave the U.S. the ammunition necessary to get more heavily involved in the conflict. That year, the number of U.S. troops deployed had risen to 16,500 from only 2,000 a few years earlier. The war escalated, and in March 1965, a series of aerial bombing attacks by U.S. and Vietnamese forces against North Vietnam commenced and continued for 3 years. During that period, Operation Rolling Thunder dropped 1 million tons of missiles, rockets, and bombs on the North. With support from the American public, the U.S. ground war also began in March '65. 3,500 Marines were sent to the South for a defensive mission, and by December, that number had risen to 200,000. However, the ARVN forces of the South experienced great losses in a number of battles over the next few months, and morale dropped. The United States then decided they must intervene even further in order to win the war. Prior to this, they had insisted it was up to the Vietnamese to end things. President Lyndon Johnson and his administration tried to spin the war and its progress in the American media by highlighting stories that showed the war's progression.
All the challenges have been met. The enemy is not beaten, but he knows that he has met his master in the field.
This made the media and the public mistrustful of the government. The Tet Offensive proved to the Americans that progress was not in fact being made. On January 31, 1968, the VCs made a surprise attack on the Southern Vietnamese and Americans. They responded quickly and effectively. However, the fight raged for months and killed President Johnson's chances of re-election.
I do not believe that I should devote an hour or a day of my time to any personal partisan causes or to any duties other than the awesome duties of this office, the presidency of your country.
By the time he left office, approximately 30,000 American lives had been lost fighting in Vietnam. When President Richard Nixon entered office in 1969, he began withdrawing troops. The policy called Vietnamization was put in place and was meant to help prepare the ARVNs to take over the battle. Amid even more attacks, U.S. public support plummeted further, especially after the National Guard killed 4 student protesters at Kent State University. Peace protests became commonplace on American soil by 1972, and the Vietnam War became a central issue in that year's presidential campaigns. After Nixon's re-election, he was able to negotiate an agreement that ended American involvement in the war.
A ceasefire, internationally supervised, will begin at 7 p.m. this Saturday, January 27, Washington time. Within 60 days from this Saturday, all Americans held prisoners of war
throughout Indochina will be released.
Signed January 27, 1973, the Paris Peace Accords resulted in a ceasefire throughout the country and the release of American prisoners of war. However, fighting between the Vietnamese states continued until 1975. On April 30, 1975, the South Vietnamese capital of Saigon was taken. The war was over and communist governments took over Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos.